Imagine seeing a minivan coming straight towards you on the highway. You have seconds to react. Now imagine finding out there were 5 children inside and then asking yourself, how the hell did they end up there? Welcome back, besties. You're listening to Thick Thighs and Murder Vibes. Before we get into today's case, I want to take a minute to talk about why there wasn't a new episode last week. If you're listening from my corner of Washington, you already know that the last couple of weeks have been pretty heavy. The wildfires around the Spokane area have affected so many people, and for a little while, releasing a new episode just wasn't the priority. There were people being evacuated, families worrying about their homes, and members of our community needing help. And when your neighbors are going through something like that, you show up. So I took some time away from recording just to be available where I could, make sure my own family was okay, and to take care of what mattered most in that moment. To everyone who has been impacted by these fires, whether you lost your home, had to evacuate, helped fight the fires, donated, volunteered, or just checked on someone you love, I see you. And to all of you who waited patiently for a new episode, thank you. Seriously, this podcast exists because you continue to show up, and I never take that for granted. So, grab your drink, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Today's case is one that has left investigators, family members, and the public asking the same question for years. How did a normal family trip end in one of the most debated tragedies in recent memory? On July 26th, 2009, Diane Schuler was driving home from a camping trip in upstate New York. Diane was 36 years old. She was a mother, she was an aunt, and she was described by people who knew her as responsible, hardworking, and someone who cared deeply about her family. She worked in Manhattan as a cable television executive and was married to Daniel Schuler. Diane and Daniel had 2 children together, a son and a daughter. She was also the aunt of 3 young girls who were in the van with her that day. And that detail matters because this wasn't a stranger with strangers. This was family. These were children who trusted the adult around them to get them home safely. And before we get any further, I want to say this because I think it's important. When we talk about cases like this, especially cases involving children, it's easy for people online to turn it into a debate where everyone forgets there are actual human beings behind the headlines. These are not just names in an article. These were children. These were siblings, daughters, nieces, cousins, and friends. So while we're going to talk about the questions, the theories, and the controversy surrounding Diane Schuler's actions that day, we're not losing sight of who was affected. The weekend before the crash, Diane, her husband Daniel, their 2 children, and several nieces had traveled to a campground in upstate New York. The group was spending time together, enjoying a summer weekend away. It was the kind of trip families take all the time. Kids running around, adults trying to relax, everyone eventually packing up and saying, "All right, time to go home." And on Sunday morning, that was exactly what was supposed to happen. Diane would drive the children home while other family members followed separately. Okay, besties, I want you to remember this moment because this is the part of the story where everything feels normal. There is no giant flashing warning sign. There's no obvious something terrible is about to happen moment. It is just a family finishing a camping trip and heading home. That's what makes this case so unsettling. Sometimes the most shocking stories don't start with something suspicious. They start with a completely ordinary day. According to investigators, Diane left the campground with the children in her Honda Odyssey. Her 2-year-old son was with her daughter was with her, and her 3 nieces, ages 2, 7, and 8, were also passengers. The drive was expected to take several hours. At some point during the trip, however, things began to change. Witnesses later reported seeing the vehicle being driven in a way that raised concerns. There were reports of erratic driving, and then came the first signs that something was seriously wrong. Diane pulled into a shopping area in West Nyack, New York. And this is where I need everyone to stay with me, because the timeline of this case is where things start getting complicated. Because depending on which version of events you look at, this stop is either something was clearly wrong and nobody understood how serious it was, or this was a moment where someone could have stepped in. And that is one of the biggest questions that follows this case. Were there moments where this tragedy could have been prevented? After leaving the campground, Diane Schuler stopped at a gas station in West Nyack, New York. This stop would later become one of the most discussed parts of the timeline because it was one of the last places where Diane and the children were seen before the crash. According to reports, Diane purchased items including food and drinks. She also made phone calls during this general time period, including calls to her brother, Warren Hance, who was the father of the three nieces riding in the van. And this is where things start getting complicated because, according to family members, Diane did not sound like someone who was in distress. She didn't sound like someone who was obviously impaired. She was having normal conversations and she was talking about the trip home. This is one of the reasons this case stayed so controversial, because when you hear wrong way crash caused by an impaired driver, our brains want the story to be simple. We want there to be a clear moment where everyone goes, oh, there it is. That's when everything changed. But real life is messy. People can appear fine right up until they aren't. People can hide things. People can be experiencing something medically or physically that nobody else can see. And sometimes, unfortunately, we only understand the warning signs after the worst has already happened. So Diane continued driving with the children in the van. And during this time, she spoke with her brother Warren. Later, Warren would say Diane seemed normal during their conversation. She reportedly mentioned feeling tired and wanting to get home, but she did not indicate that she was in danger or unable to drive. There was no emergency call, no request for help, no obvious sign to anyone listening that something catastrophic was about to happen. And this is where my brain starts doing the true crime thing where you go, okay, but did the people around her know? And then you have to remind yourself, we have the luxury of knowing the ending. Everyone involved that day was living the middle of the story. They didn't know they were in the middle of a tragedy. They thought it was just a Sunday drive home. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, emergency dispatchers began receiving calls about a vehicle driving erratically on the Taconic State Parkway. Multiple drivers reported seeing a minivan traveling southbound in the northbound lanes. Think about that for a second. A major highway, cars moving at highway speeds, and one vehicle heading directly towards traffic. I can't imagine being another driver on that road. You're just driving, minding your own business. Maybe you're listening to music or thinking about what you're making for dinner. Maybe you're arguing with your GPS because somehow it thinks you should make a U-turn into a lake. And then suddenly you realize, wait, that car is coming toward me. That's absolutely terrifying. Several drivers attempted to avoid the minivan. Some were able to move out of the way. Others called 911. But eventually, the Honda Odyssey collided head-on with another vehicle. The impact killed Diane Schuler. It also killed her 2-year-old daughter, her 3 nieces, and the 3 occupants of the SUV she struck. Only one child survived, Diane's 5-year-old son, who was seriously injured. This is the part of the story where we have to stop and acknowledge the magnitude of what happened. Behind every headline about this case were families who woke up one morning expecting to come home from a camping trip, parents who expected to see their children walk through the door, families who had no idea that a completely ordinary weekend was about to become something they would carry forever. There are no theories or debates that change that loss. Once investigators arrived, the questions began immediately. What caused Diane Schuler to drive the wrong way? Was she impaired? Was she suffering from a medical emergency? Was something else happening inside the vehicle? Investigators began reconstructing the final hours of Diane's life. They examined the crash scene, they reviewed witness statements, they looked at phone records, and then came the piece of evidence that would completely change public perception: the toxicology results. And this is where the case takes the turn that made it explode nationally. Because up until this point, people are looking at a horrible crash and trying to understand what happened. But once the toxicology results came out, suddenly everybody had an opinion. Suddenly, everybody thought they knew the answer. And that's when this case went from a tragedy to a debate. When investigators released the toxicology results from Diane Schuler's autopsy, the case took a dramatic turn. According to the findings, Diane had alcohol and THC, which, of course, is the active ingredient in marijuana. Those were both in her system at the time of the crash. The medical examiner determined that her blood alcohol level was above the legal driving limit. And suddenly, a case that many people had viewed as a tragic accident became something much more complicated. The question changed. It was no longer only what caused Diane Schuler to lose control of the vehicle. It became, was Diane Schuler impaired when she got behind the wheel? And this is where we need to slow down, because this case has become one of those situations where people tend to pick a side immediately. Some people hear the toxicology results and say, that's it, case closed. Other people hear the family's explanations and say, there has to be another answer. But real investigations are rarely that simple. A piece of evidence can be extremely important while still leaving questions behind. Diane's family strongly disputed the idea that she was drunk or impaired while driving. Her husband, Daniel Schuler, and other family members said they did not believe Diane had been drinking that day. They described her as someone who was responsible and someone who would never knowingly put children in danger. They questioned whether the toxicology results told the entire story. They suggested that something else could have contributed to what happened, including the possibility of a medical emergency. And I want to point something out here. When someone you love dies in a situation like this, your brain is trying to make sense of something that feels impossible, especially when children are involved. The idea that someone you knew and loved could make a decision that resulted in so much devastation is incredibly difficult to accept. So, of course, people look for another explanation. They look for the missing piece, the thing that makes the story make sense again. One theory that gained significant attention was that Diane may have experienced some kind of medical crisis while driving. And I want to spend some time here because this is where the case gets really complicated from a medical standpoint. The family and their supporters weren't just throwing out random ideas. They were asking legitimate medical questions that deserved to be explored. So, let's talk about those questions. One possibility that was raised was whether Diane could have suffered a stroke or what's called a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, sometimes called a mini stroke. A stroke occurs when blood flow to a part of the brain is blocked or when a blood vessel in the brain ruptures. A TIA is similar but temporary. The blockage clears on its own, usually within minutes or hours. But both of those can cause sudden confusion, difficulty speaking or understanding speech, loss of coordination, impaired judgment, vision problems, and disorientation. And here's the thing that makes this theory compelling to some people. Someone having a stroke might not realize they're having a stroke. They might feel off, but not understand the severity. They might continue doing what they're doing, like driving, because their brain isn't processing that something is catastrophically wrong. Medical experts who reviewed the case noted that certain types of strokes, particularly those affecting the right side of the brain, can cause something called spatial neglect. This means a person might literally not perceive one side of their environment. They might not see cars coming from one direction. They might not understand they're on the wrong side of the road. Another medical possibility that was discussed was whether Diane experienced a seizure or had an undiagnosed seizure disorder. Not all seizures look like what we see on TV. Some seizures, called complex partial seizures or absence seizures, can cause staring spells, confusion, automatic behaviors like continuing to drive, loss of awareness, and inability to respond appropriately to surroundings. A person having this type of seizure might appear to be functioning. They might even continue complex tasks, but they're essentially on autopilot with no real awareness or control. Some neurologists have pointed out that seizures can sometimes be triggered by stress, lack of sleep, low blood sugar, and dehydration, all things that could potentially happen on a camping trip with young children. And even though Diane was not known to be diabetic, some medical professionals raised questions about whether she could have experienced severe hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, which hypoglycemia can cause confusion and disorientation, difficulty concentrating, impaired judgment, vision changes, aggressive or unusual behavior, and loss of consciousness. And here's what makes this particularly interesting. The symptoms of severe hypoglycemia can actually mimic intoxication, with slurred speech, unsteady movements, confusion, erratic behavior. There are documented cases of people with hypoglycemia being mistaken for drunk drivers. Some supporters of the medical emergency theory pointed out that Diane had stopped at a gas station and purchased food and drinks. Could she have been feeling the effects of low blood sugar and trying to correct it? Could she have been in the early stages of a medical crisis that she didn't fully understand? And then, of course, there is dental abscess and infection. This was one of the later known theories, but it's worth mentioning because it came up during the family's investigation. Diane had reportedly been experiencing tooth pain in the weeks before the crash. Some medical experts noted that a severe dental abscess can, and in rare cases, lead to sepsis, brain abscess, altered mental status, fever, and confusion. Could an untreated infection have been affecting Diane's cognitive function? It's a theory that some found plausible, though difficult to prove after the fact. This is where we get to the really difficult part of the medical theory. Diagnosing a medical event after someone has died is incredibly challenging. Dr. Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist hired by the family, noted that certain medical conditions leave no trace after death. A seizure doesn't show up on an autopsy. A TIA might not leave visible evidence. Hypoglycemia can't be definitively diagnosed post-mortem because blood sugar levels change after death. The toxicology report showed alcohol and THC, but toxicology doesn't tell you whether a person was also having a stroke, whether they were experiencing a seizure, or whether another medical event was happening simultaneously. Multiple things can be true at the same time. Several medical professionals who reviewed the case noted that the family's questions weren't unreasonable. Some pointed out that Diane's behavior, particularly the fact that she continued driving despite being in obvious danger, was unusual even for someone who was impaired. Most impaired drivers, even severely impaired drivers, don't drive the wrong way on a highway for nearly 2 miles. They might swerve, they might drive slowly, they might make poor decisions. But sustained wrong-way driving, especially in daylight with clear visibility, suggested to some experts that something more than impairment might have been at play. Dr. Daniel Aman, a psychiatrist and brain imaging specialist, suggested that Diane's behavior was more consistent with someone experiencing a brain injury or neurological event than simple intoxication. Other experts disagreed, noting that the level of alcohol in her system was sufficient to cause severe impairment, and that impaired judgment could explain the wrong way driving. Despite all of these theories and the questions raised by medical professionals, investigators and the medical examiner did not find definitive evidence that a medical event was the primary cause of the crash. The official conclusion remained that Diane was impaired by alcohol and THC. But the medical questions didn't go away. And for the family, the lack of definitive medical explanation didn't mean one didn't exist. It meant that the tools available to investigators couldn't detect it. And this is where I think we have to sit with something uncomfortable. Sometimes the truth is that we can't know everything. The medical theories aren't just family members grasping at straws. They're legitimate questions based on real medical possibilities. But legitimate questions don't automatically mean these things happened. What we're left with is evidence that points in one direction and questions that point in another. And maybe both things can be true. The toxicology results are real, and there are still medical questions we can't fully answer. That's not a satisfying conclusion, but it might be the most honest one. Because I know some of you listening may have heard another theory connected to this case, the idea of autobrewery syndrome. And autobrewery syndrome is a rare condition where the body can produce alcohol internally due to fermentation in the digestive system. It has been documented in medical literature, but it is extremely uncommon. Diane Schuler's case, however, has not been confirmed as an example of autobrewery syndrome. There is no established evidence that this condition caused what happened that day. I actually want to pause here because this is the perfect example of why we have to be careful in true crime. Sometimes a theory is interesting. Sometimes a theory is worth exploring. But interesting does not automatically mean proven. And there is a huge difference between could this happen and did this happen? Those are two very different questions. Even with the official findings, people have continued debating this case. Some questions people still ask include, why did Diane choose to continue driving if she was feeling unwell? Did anyone around her notice anything unusual before she left? Could someone have intervened? Was there a medical component that investigators missed? Or the explanation simply the one supported by the evidence? This is the part of the case that sticks with people. Not because we don't have information. We actually have a lot of information. We have witness accounts, phone records, toxicology, and we have an investigation. But what we don't have is the one thing everyone wants, and that's Diane's side of the story. The only person who could truly explain what happened inside that vehicle was also one of the people who died that day. The Diane Schuler case became a national conversation. News outlets covered it extensively. Documentaries explored the competing theories. And people online debated whether Diane should be remembered as someone who made a devastating choice or someone who experienced an unknown medical crisis. And listen, this is where I'm going to put on my bestie who cares about facts hat. We can talk about evidence, we can question timelines, we can discuss theories. But we also have to remember that this was a tragedy involving real people. The goal isn't to create a villain because our brains want someone to blame. The goal is to understand what happened and remember the people whose lives were changed forever. So after everything we've talked about, the camping trip, the drive home, the crash, the investigation, and the toxicology results, we're left with the question that has followed this case since 2009. What really happened to Diane Schuler? The official findings concluded that Diane was impaired at the time of the crash. Investigators determined that alcohol and THC were present in her system, and the circumstances surrounding the crash were consistent with impaired driving. But even with those conclusions, this case continues to be debated because the people closest to Diane have never accepted that explanation. And this is where I think it's important to separate two things: understanding what the evidence says and understanding why people still have questions. Those can exist at the same time. You can look at the evidence and say, okay, I understand why investigators reached that conclusion. And you can also acknowledge that the people who loved Diane were left trying to process something incredibly painful and complicated. The first and most widely accepted explanation is that Diane was impaired while driving. According to the official investigation, the alcohol and THC found in her system contributed to the crash. Supporters of this explanation point to the toxicology results, witness reports of erratic driving, and the fact that Diane continued driving despite being on a dangerous path. From this perspective, the tragedy was the result of a devastating decision. And this is the part that is the hardest to sit with, because if impairment was the cause, then this wasn't some mysterious outside force. It was a choice made before the vehicle ever entered that highway. And when children are involved, that is a reality people understandably struggle with. The second theory is that Diane experienced some kind of medical emergency. Supporters of this theory point to questions about her behavior, the possibility that she was not intentionally putting anyone in danger, and the fact that the family members said the Diane they knew would never knowingly drive while impaired with children in the vehicle. However, no medical explanation has been officially confirmed as the cause of the crash. Another difficult part of this case is that Diane cannot tell us what happened. She can't explain what she was feeling during the drive, whether she realized something was wrong, whether she knew she was unsafe to drive, and whether she believed she could make it home. The person with the answers was lost in the same tragedy everyone else was trying to understand. And that right there is what makes this case so haunting. Not because it's a mystery where we have no evidence, but because we have the evidence and we still have a missing piece. There is a moment in every case where investigators wish they could go back, make one more phone call, ask one more question, and notice one more thing. But unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. Before we talk about remembering the victims, I want to spend a few minutes on something that doesn't get discussed as much. How the Diane Schuler case changed the way we talk about impaired driving, intervention, and tragedy. Because this case didn't just become a headline and then disappear. It became a reference point, a teaching moment, and in some ways, a catalyst for difficult conversations we needed to have. One of the immediate impacts of this case was a renewed focus on child passenger safety and the responsibility adults have when children are in their care. Organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration used this case as an example in their campaigns. Not to vilify Diane, but to remind people when you get behind the wheel with children in your vehicle, you are responsible for their lives. The case prompted discussions about how do we create a culture where it's okay to say, I'm not okay to drive? How do we make it easier for people to ask for help? What systems can we put in place so that children are never in a vehicle with an impaired driver? Some schools and parenting organizations began including discussions about this case in their safety education programs. The message wasn't about blame, it was about prevention. One of the most painful questions that emerged from this case was, could someone have intervened? Should the gas station attendant have noticed something was wrong? Should Warren have pushed harder when Diane said she wasn't feeling well? Should other family members have insisted on different travel arrangements? And this question has become part of a broader conversation about bystander intervention. After this case, some public safety campaigns began focusing on how to recognize signs that someone is impaired, how to have difficult conversations with family members about their ability to drive, the importance of speaking up even when it's uncomfortable. There's a campaign now called Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk. I'm sure we've all heard of that. That specifically addresses the fear of offending someone versus the responsibility of keeping them safe. The Diane Schuler case is often referenced in these discussions because it represents the worst case scenario of what happens when nobody intervenes. This case has also become a teaching tool in legal and medical settings. Law schools use it to discuss wrongful death litigation, the burden of proof in civil versus criminal cases, how families navigate the legal system after tragedy, and the role of expert witness in disputed cases. Medical schools and forensic pathology programs use it to discuss the limitations of postmortem diagnosis, how to communicate uncertain findings to families, the challenge of distinguishing between impairment and medical emergency, and the importance of considering multiple possibilities in complex cases. Emergency medicine programs have used this case to train first responders on recognizing the difference between intoxication and medical crisis, the importance of thorough evaluation even when impairment seems obvious, and how to document findings in ways that allow for later analysis. Perhaps the most significant conversation this case sparked was about how we balance accountability with compassion when tragedy occurs. On one side, people argue we have to hold people accountable for their choices, especially when those choices harm others. On the other side, people argue we have to have compassion for the complexity of human behavior and the possibility that we don't understand everything that happened. This case has become a touchstone of discussions about how we talk about people who cause harm, whether it's possible to acknowledge someone's responsibility while also acknowledging their humanity, and how families of victims and families of perpetrators both deserve support. The difference between explaining behavior and excusing it. Victim advocacy groups and restorative justice programs have used this case to explore these questions. From a practical standpoint, this case also contributes to discussions about highway safety. After the Taconic Parkway crash, transportation officials in New York and other states began reviewing wrong-way driving direction systems, signage and road design that could prevent wrong way entry, technology that could alert authorities more quickly when wrong way driving is reported, and the effectiveness of rumble strips and other physical deterrents. Some highways now have enhanced wrong way direction systems that were developed or improved in part because of high profile cases like this one. One of the most important shifts that cases like this have contributed to is the growing emphasis on speaking up when you're concerned about someone's ability to drive. Public health campaigns now encourage calling someone you trust if you don't feel safe driving, having a plan before you go out, whether that's a designated driver, a rideshare, or just another form of getting home, checking in with a family member if they seem off, and not assuming someone is fine just because they say they are. The phrase, "it's better to be embarrassed than dead," has become common in these campaigns. And while it's impossible to know if any of these changes would have prevented what happened to Diane Schuler and the children in her care, the hope is that future tragedies might be prevented. And I think it's important to acknowledge because sometimes when we talk about true crime, it can feel like we're just rehashing tragedy for entertainment. But cases like this one have real world impact. They change policies, they change conversations, they change how people think about their own behavior and their responsibility to others. That doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't bring anybody back. But it means that the people who were lost weren't lost for nothing. Their stories become part of a larger effort to prevent future tragedies. And I think that matters. Before we close out today's episode, I want to take a moment to remember the people at the center of this tragedy. 8 people lost their lives that day. Diane Schuler, her daughter Erin, her 3 nieces, Emma, Allison, and Katie Hance, and the 3 people in the vehicle she collided with, Guy Bastardi, his father Michael Bastardi, and their friend Daniel Longo. Behind every headline, every theory, and every debate were families who had to wake up to unimaginable loss. Warren Hance lost all 3 of his daughters in an instant. Daniel Schuler lost his wife and daughter. The Bastardi family lost a father, a son, and a friend. And while this case continues to be discussed, those lives are what should remain at the center. Because at the end of the day, true crime isn't just about solving puzzles. It's about remembering that these were real people, real families, real futures that were changed in an instant. The questions matter. The evidence matters, but the people matter more. The Diane Schuler case remains one of those stories where everyone walks away with a different feeling. Some people see a tragedy caused by impaired driving. Some people see unanswered questions. Some people see a family trying to understand something impossible. But maybe the hardest truth about this case is that there may never be an explanation that satisfies anyone. Because sometimes the scariest part of a story isn't that we don't know what happened. It's that the answer we have still leaves us asking questions. So that's where we're going to leave today's case. As always, I want to remind you that behind every headline is a person, behind every case is a family, and behind every mystery are people whose lives were forever changed. And before I let you go, I do have a little surprise for you. Next week, I'm handing the microphone over to a very special guest host. Don't worry, I'll still be here causing chaos. But I'm letting somebody else bring the murder vibes for a change. And trust me, you're going to want to hear this one. And as always, thank you for hanging out with me, for listening, for sharing these episodes, and for being part of this weird little corner of the internet that we've created together. Until next time. Lock your doors, trust your gut, and remember, sometimes the road home isn't as safe as we think it is.